Hello everyone and welcome back into another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Wednesday to you all. We have officially made it to Hump Day this week. We still have a lot to talk about, including the start of the week 6 of the NFL season in a day's time. Thursday Night Football between my Seattle Seahawks and the San Francisco 49ers, the first divisional game of the year for the Seattle Seahawks. A very big one for both teams, one that admittedly I'm dreading a little bit as a Seattle fan. I'm going to have you covered, though, in all things general betting and also prop betting as well. For that, we continue as well with our positional rankings, continuing with our wide receivers and tight ends as always, and then I conclude today's show by giving you my weekly shout-out report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups that will define fantasy football for this week. It should be a good one, but before we begin with any of it, I do want to ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. It is greatly appreciated if you do feel so inclined by all concerned, especially me and my fellow podcasters who are doing their own great things in their own right. Go check them out as well as soon as you subscribe. But another way to interact with this show specifically and directly throughout its duration is to consider leaving a Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers feature here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show. I definitely want to hear your guys' opinion. It's not just all about me talking about whatever topics I want to talk about. I want to include as many different diverse topics that you feel should be spoken about on this show. I'm open to all questions, comments, and concerns, and it just makes this show that much better, and it continues to grow the network as a whole as well. So if you feel so inclined, consider leaving that, and I will be eternally grateful, and the show and network will be as well. Without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of today, starting off with tomorrow night's game. Thursday Night Football, Seahawks, 49ers. A lot of stakes on the line. The Seahawks coming into this one 3-2. Kind of disappointing to be at 3-2 at this stage in the season, because this feels like the point where Seattle will have a huge drop-off, because their schedule was perhaps one of the lighter ones in the schedule in the NFL up to this point, only playing one team that purportedly will be in the NFC playoff picture in Detroit, and we saw what happened there. I'm not making any excuses about the defense, even though I want to, but that's what it was. That's the kind of situation Seattle is in. And then this past weekend, losing to the New York Giants of all teams in embarrassing fashion almost, because of the fact that even though, they had now 2 weeks where they knew they were going to be down a lot of their star defensive players, they didn't look like they changed anything. And that's a problem. That's always been a problem as a Seattle fan since the early 2010s. Nothing necessarily changes from the Legion of Boom era to now, where you can see the Seattle defense improving. In the first 3 games, I don't necessarily want to say it was mirage, because I still have hope, but it certainly speaks to the fact that they're now 3-2, and they were 3-0 after facing Bo Nix, Skylar Thompson, and Jacoby Brissett. And after facing one, not necessarily the most competent quarterback, but at least someone who we know can stick to a game plan, in Jared Goff, and then Daniel Jones is the other one, kind of falling apart defensively. And now they head into this Thursday night game on the road against San Fran. And this is what, Mike McDonald signed up for, right? I feel like the reason why Seattle hired Mike McDonald is not necessarily to, completely focus on revamping the defense, but focus on beating it or catching up to the NFC West, the rest of the NFC West, and specifically the McVay-Shanahan style offenses that they know they'll be facing. And so this game is the litmus test. Even though both teams are banged up, let's look at the 49ers. They have a lot of pieces missing, most chief among them the McCaffrey injury, and they have a kicker down now, which is a very integral part of what they do if they kind of stall in the red zone, which has been happening more so often for them than any other season in the Brock Purdy, Kyle Shanahan era, where they haven't finished drives, then that becomes a problem as well. And so this game certainly feels like it'll be close, but I think the betting odds and myself specifically, as a Seattle fan, think otherwise. Looking at the betting odds, the over-under is 47.5. I believe the line right now is San Fran as 5.5-point favorites. Seattle is at plus 135, and San Fran is at minus 185 to win this game. And the way I see it, I feel like Seattle certainly seems like it has an infrastructure that it feels it can follow to get wins. But it's mainly on the offensive side of the ball. When you see the offensive side of the ball for Seattle, you see an offense that plays mistake-free football that, kind of keeps Geno Smith upright behind that very makeshift offensive line, and most importantly, feels like it can score on multiple drives and keep opposing defenses on their toes and keep them honest. Whereas on the defensive side of the football, I don't know whether it's kind of this weird alteration from the Pete Carroll mindset to the Mike Macdonald mindset, where there's a more serious approach to how Mike Macdonald approaches defensive scheming. But it certainly feels like there's a disconnect, because I feel like when you're a team like Seattle, you need that secondary depth to really help you, that tertiary depth to really sustain you going forward. And it feels like Mike Macdonald is kind of lost without the players that he has at his disposal that are quote-unquote his superstar players. His Leonard Williams, his Byron Murphys, his Boye Mafes. And now it's almost as if the Seattle Seahawks are playing a bend-don't-break game, but mostly breaking because either A, the players that are on the field are not confident in their own abilities, and that might be a coaching thing, or B, they're just plain out bad. And I think it's a mixture of the both. The fact that there is still some players that we've retained who just aren't worthy of the Seattle Seahawks defensive ways and just don't belong on the field. And then when you bring in a kind of tough luck guy in Mike Macdonald after, happy-go-lucky Pete Carroll, there is a clear cultural change there. You can't ignore the fact that Mike Macdonald is more like, we have to clean the slate and we can't let distractions in, whereas Pete Carroll was all about keeping this youthful energy, so to speak. And so, headed into this game, the challenge for Seattle is to kind of accept that they're not going to win this game defensively like people thought, but feel like they have a unique opportunity on the offensive side of the ball to make this a shootout. On the San Fran side of things, I feel like it's just about sustaining drives. And you can definitely control the ball against the Seattle defense. The Giants had a great example of that. Really balanced offensive performance from them last week in Seattle in that huge upset. But the thing about San Fran is that this year, I feel like they're kind of playing it much more safe than we expected. And it's to be expected as well, because we can't ignore the injuries. But these players they have on their roster still are fantastic players. You just have to, account for them differently. Because Jordan Mason's is still a very solid physical back who I really like. And fantasy managers also like him as well. And then you have a guy like Jawan Jennings, who has actually been on this team for quite some time, has the experience, loves being like that solid route runner in that system. And then you have Brandon Ayuk still and George Kittle as well. So you don't have scrubs at these positions. These are guys who have been in this system, understand this system. But I feel like there's a sense of timidity there. Maybe it's a little bit of that Super Bowl hangover where they were so close to winning that game in overtime and they just let it all slip. And they lost in the last play, and right now they can't get that out of their heads. And they're kind of stuck in that mindset of, we were so close, but yet no cigar. And so I kind of feel like Had, McCaffrey been there to start the year, they definitely would have felt calmer. But with, this leading into the offseason as well, into this year, kind of muddied the waters in San Fran a little bit, which is why they're here. And that, kind of comeback upset that they had against Arizona, where they were up 13, I believe late in the third, and then Arizona comes storming back, just doesn't happen to a team like San Francisco, even with all those injuries. So this game, as Untamed Music enters the chat, welcome to you, my friend. And he's asking about a trade. What side wins this trade in half PPR? Gibbs, Darnold, Dell, and Quentin Johnston for Marvin Harrison Jr., Najee Harris, Baker Mayfield, and Andrews. Well, I think the side that wins it is the one with Gibbs, Darnold, Dell, and Johnston. And the reason why is that, yes, in PPR, it's not just about touches, it's about receptions and what you do with those receptions. But I feel like the Gibbs, Darnold, Dell, Johnston side of things represents a group of players that kind of seem tertiary in nature. That they're not big superstars, but they're so vital to their team's offenses that you can't ignore their output. Let's look at Gibbs, for example. This year, you can't say he's been the best Lions running back, because David Montgomery has looked really impressive. But he sustains what the Lions can do in the run game with what he does. And he's not just a solid runner, he's a solid receiver as well. Sam Darnold, he's a QB, and you have to view him differently in this sense. But he is perhaps the most vital quarterback of the NFL season so far for what the Vikings are doing with him. And then Dell and Johnston, two receivers who don't get a lot of attention in their respective teams. Maybe Tank Dell gets at least a little bit more attention because of that receiver room. But both of them have proven that with the touches they get, they can make magic happen. Especially a guy like Quentin Johnston, who this time last year, a lot of people were skeptical of in terms of how he would fit into the Chargers offense. And not for nothing, yes, they're a running team, but Johnston already has more receiving touchdowns than he had last year. So that's something worth noting. Whereas the Marvin, Najee, Baker, Andrews trade side of things is a little bit more unusual in nature. So I feel like that group isn't necessarily bad. I just feel like either one or two of them kind of drags down what that trade could be. So I would pick the Gibbs, Darnold, and Dell side. Hopefully that's your side of the offer. Good luck to you and your fantasy football exploits, my friends, and welcome to the show. But quickly before we end this first segment here, my prediction is that San Fran will cover. I feel like Seattle's too banged up defensively to really account for the still solid weapons that the San Fran offense has on the offensive side of the ball. So that's my prediction. Let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for this first segment, though. Coming up next, we're going to transition to the prop bet side of things. What are some popular ones that I think will hit for tomorrow night's game? We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second one of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show and throughout countless others across the network, if you feel so inclined, leave a super chat, super thanks, or super sticker here in my chat, and I will read it aloud because I definitely want to hear your guys' opinions. The same goes for any other shows you may watch across the GSMC Sports Network, and that also leads into the fact that I believe you should like, follow, and subscribe if you love this show and others that you've seen across the network. Just really support the network is greatly appreciated by all concerned as well. Without further ado, let's jump into our second segment, transitioning from a general kind of betting preview surrounding tomorrow night's game in the NFC West to a prop bets preview, because this game on the offensive side of the football for both sides feels like it can be a shootout. And not for nothing, I feel that's the best way Seattle can potentially win this game. But as you can see, there are going to be a lot of players across both teams who I feel very highly about, and others who might underperform. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into it then. Let's start off with the 49ers, because I didn't necessarily mention them as much as I wanted to in my first segment. I'll start off with Brock Purdy. This year has shown that those kind of rumors about him being more of a system QB might ring true, but he has now proven enough to me where I can say at least he can competently lead this Niners team without, his big pieces. I think the main piece that he can't necessarily go without is Trent Williams along that offensive line, because he really changes both positively and negatively what this line looks like for the Niners. If he's not there, that's trouble. That's huge trouble for them on that line. But he's proven that he's been solid. And in this game, against, like I said, a banged-up Seattle defense that might not be just ready for it quite yet, ready for them quite yet on the defensive side of the football, I think he'll have a big day. So I'm going to say hitting the over here. 249.5 yards and at minus 110. That's a pretty solid bet that I'm confident to take in him. I'm not going so far as to start him in my fantasies team because in Baker we trust, but Brock is still someone who I appreciate now. And it's kind of funny as a Seattle fan saying I appreciate someone who is my biggest rival, but he has earned my respect. Let's not forget what he's been doing with this makeshift team. He's keeping them afloat at the very least. It's not entirely his fault that the Cardinals came back on him or the Rams came back on him. It's just that, I feel like their losses are becoming too many and it might catch up to them. But not in this game. I think this will be a fantastic game for Brock Purdy in this one. Let's go to his backfield partner, not Christian McCaffrey nowadays. It's Jordan Mason in that backfield. And as far as the run game goes for San Fran, I feel like it could be good. But for some reason, I feel like that's an area of the game plan that Seattle will want to hone in on. Taking away at least one aspect, and that's probably the run game. Because, yes, a lot of the damage in terms of injuries to Seattle's defense is up front. But at the end of the day, I just feel like Jordan Mason is at least someone who you can contain a little bit better than Christian McCaffrey. Because Christian McCaffrey, you kind of have to account for him all over the field. But Jordan Mason, is honed in on wearing you down. So if you can match Jordan Mason in this game, then he's going to hit the under. And that's what I expect will happen. Under 83.5 yards, minus 114 in this game for Mr. Jordan Mason. And it's not a bad thing because I still think he can add value in this game by diversifying San Fran's game script. Say if Kyle Shanahan uses him a little bit more in the receiving game, then yes, there are many more ways than you can exploit Seattle's defense, keep them on their toes. But at the end of the day, if we're taking Jordan Mason as just a pure runner kind of running back, then I don't necessarily think he'll have the best of days because Seattle will at least want to damage or hone in on one aspect of the San Fran offense that they want to attack. And so that's why I feel Jordan Mason won't perform up to par in this one. And then the last player I'm going to acknowledge here for the San Francisco 49ers in this one is Jauan Jennings, a kind of Jekyll and Hyde player here where you know he's very integral to how this San Fran offense operates, even with all the players they still have when they're fully healthy. But he's kind of someone who doesn't necessarily inject himself into the games. He's someone who kind of needs a quote-unquote moment to really open up his game. We saw it against the Rams when he went off for 3 touchdowns, and I think we're going to see it in this game where against a very, down on its luck Seattle secondary, he can feel like he can exploit this defense. And he's perhaps the best route runner out of all the wide receivers in their kind of makeshift group without Samuel, without, even a guy like McCaffrey catching out of the backfield. He's the one who can really diagnose how to break down defenses with his route running. And so that's why I feel he's going to hit the over in tonight's game and tomorrow night's game and hit way over in that regard at 28.5 yards. I feel like a bargain bet. So Jauan Jennings hitting the over in this one just feels like perhaps maybe even the safest bet, if you can believe it, for the San Fran offense. And that's saying something, because if you would have told me that 6 weeks ago at the start of the season for San Francisco that Jauan Jennings could potentially have over 30 yards in one or more games, then I would have probably laughed in your face. But that is the case right now, and it's going to be the case going forward for as long as, this roster on the offensive side of the ball is not healthy. So you have to take into consideration who Jauan Jennings is and what he means to this offense. Let's go over to the Seattle side of things, because this offense, like I said, certainly has the propensity to score a lot of points. It's just that they have to play perfect football, mistake-free football, in order to do that. And this game, I feel like, can be a shootout for Seattle. And it can be a game that, hey, they potentially are in late into the fourth quarter. But at the end of the day, all these bets are contingent on, whether or not the 49ers are wearing down your defense. Because we saw, it's not just about, scoring more points than Seattle offense. It's about owning the time of possession battle. That's what Detroit and New York did a great job of. With their balanced attacks, they were able to keep the Seattle offense off the field, and most importantly, wear down a defense that could not handle what they were throwing at them. And so that's what I feel like this game could be about, because all these prop bets I have for Seattle could hit, but they just have to have the ball for longer, if you know what I mean. But starting off with Geno, he's been pretty sterling these past couple of weeks in terms of the yardage production he puts up. Yes, he hasn't had a game where he's thrown multiple touchdown passes, and that's a little bit worrying, but he still has been perhaps one of the more consistent QBs in the league. He's playing the style of offense they need to stay in games, and he's playing it to the T. And so, Geno, I feel like, in terms of over-under kind of betting, is someone who I would honestly trust going forward week by week to hit the over. And at minus 114 this week at 248.5 yards, I feel pretty confident in saying he will. And then Kenneth Walker, kind of an interesting player because we saw he was utilized very heavily in that game against Detroit, but then had only about 5 touches against New York. So he certainly is someone I'm skeptical of really getting going, but he still is perhaps the best player, or most important player rather, on that Seattle offense, because as he goes, so goes the Seattle offense. And that's a fact. And so if he doesn't have a big game, then I don't think any of these prop bets are really appealing for Seattle, or for you as a bettor, if any bettors are watching. At over 59.5 yards, though, I kind of feel like he will have bigger say in this game. It's a divisional game, and you need to stick with your guns, stick with what you know best on the offensive side of the football, and that's running the football. And the last bet How about an underrated one and an underrated player in the Seattle system at that? Jackson Smith-Njigba. I love this guy. I think he has the raw potential to be wide receiver 2, supplant Tyler Lockett for that role. But right now, it just feels like the Seattle passing game is too kind of short and sweet to really kind of make me think that any receiver outside of, say, DK, who's really just a game changer, is going to really step up. It's all about a committee approach. We've seen so many different players on the Seattle offense catch passes this season. And JSN, he's kind of been a sneaky, underrated guy, but in terms of yardage production, not necessarily. And so I'm going to say he hits the under in this one at 49.5 yards. Not saying he's a terrible player, not saying he won't grow into his own here in Seattle, but I feel like as of right now, what they got going in the passing game is a good thing, distributing the wealth. And so someone's going to have to take a hit because of it, and I see JSN as being that guy. But overall, these prop bets are very interesting. Let me know what you think about them in the comments, because there are a lot of situations I can foresee in this game, and I don't necessarily think that all of these prop bets will hit, but I feel like they're the best ones that I could find. Let me know what you think. But coming up on the other side of things, we are going to resume our positional rankings, starting off with the wide receivers here today and the ones that I think will shine in Week 6. So we'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for this segment, we are going to be picking up where we left off with our positional rankings with the wide receiver position. Again, much like yesterday, I have found myself in kind of a conundrum where, remember, I pick all of these players based off the matchups before the previous week has even started. So what that means is, on Saturdays, I look at all the matchups, not knowing what's going to happen in Sunday's games. And so I just sit here and give you my opinion, whatever happens to these respective wide receivers, no matter how good or bad they were. And I don't account for injuries. And one of my guys that I picked going into this week got injured. And we just got news that he'll be out for an extended period of time on the IR, and that is unfortunately Nico Collins, who is really proving himself to be one of the premier wide receivers in this league. We wish him the best. Hope for a speedy recovery for him, because he truly is an incredible player for that Houston Texans offense. But alas, it is what it is, and we must move on with this segment. So without further ado, I will give you now the 3 wide receivers that I feel will alter matchups. And this is just a weird week in terms of wide receivers. And we'll talk about this a little bit later with the Shadow Report, but it just feels like a weird week where I couldn't really find matchups that would not necessarily, overwhelming you, quote-unquote, win you fantasy games. These are matchups that I feel like are tactical battles and could determine not just on-the-field results, but how your fantasy week plays out. That's what I always try to do. I try to delineate between how I feel these games will play out on the field, but also how they could impact your personal fantasy team and your personal fantasy stats. So without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Starting off with the receiver, who has seen this segment many times, and who I really love, and who y'all probably really love at this point in his career, Mike Evans. Another divisional game for the Bucs after a painful one. Last Thursday night feels like a long time ago against the Falcons. And I just feel like, no matter how the Bucs look, Mike Evans always looks like perhaps the best player on the field. And I can't even explain it at this point, because when Mike Evans came into this league, he was viewed as a guy who could potentially become, much like he is now, a wide receiver one, a superstar wide receiver. But he really didn't have many traits that said to people, okay, this guy is a future Hall of Famer. And yet that is where we sit in his 10th year in the league. Mike Evans deserves all the plaudits for what he's done, not just in real life but in fantasy. He might just be perhaps one of, if not the most important, I'll say, not best, because that's a huge kind of scope to lay out here. But he's one of the most important players in fantasy in perhaps the past decade. And I'm not putting that lightly, because I think that, as a wide receiver, most importantly, Mike Evans is someone who week in, week out is perhaps the most important player in your team, depending on whether you draft him or not. And with 23.2 fantasy points versus Atlanta last week, the sky's the limit for him. If Baker continues to play in this way, and this offense is humming and purring, then Mike Evans is going to have another career year. He's going to have another 1,000-yard season, and we're looking at perhaps one of the best wide receiving careers in the history of the NFL. Not many people can say, not even guys like Jerry Rice and Randy Moss can touch the production that Mike Evans has put out. And I love him, especially in divisional games, because no one in the NFC South has a difference maker like Mike Evans. And you can say whatever you want in the comments. Let me know what you think about that statement. But I think no one player in the NFC South is as vital and integral to their team's success than Mike Evans is right now, and has been for them for the past decade. So Mike Evans is always going to be in the discussion to make my personal rankings. But then the next guy, let's talk about one of my personal guys, a guy who I've grown to love in this season in my fantasy team, DJ Moore. Going up against perhaps still the worst defense in the league in the Jags, and I know it's a matchups thing, but let's talk about how DJ Moore has really stepped up. I feel like at the start of the season, the reason this offense stagnated was because Caleb Williams was throwing to a wide receiver trio that was, while very talented, he didn't necessarily trust because he's a rookie and he didn't know any better. But now we're seeing that having a guy in DJ Moore who has been with the Bears for many years and knows this system, as Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, whoa, Rice and Moss overshadowed by Evans, can't swallow that. I'm going to say that proudly with my chest. I respect Jerry Rice and Moss as legendary wide receivers of the game. But 10 1,000-yard seasons on a Buccaneers team that never really was relevant until, yes, Brady got there, but now are shocking people with Baker and what he's been able to do with this team, and Mike Evans has always been at the center of it all, that's impressive. Yes, Rice and Moss, in terms of the attention they got, in terms of what they meant for the game, and to having the numbers to back it up, means something, but you can't overlook what Mike Evans has done to propel the Buccaneers into relevancy, most importantly, because, the Vikings were still kind of good in that time, and who knows what they could look like without him, but I still think that's a very good team if you take him away. And not for nothing, the 49ers were the same. The Buccaneers are kind of Mike Evans, if you get my drift. As much as, Brady and his aura kind of led them to the Super Bowl, Mike Evans was a big part of that. And so that's what I'm going to say. As Sheppy Smith says, he needs at least 2 more 1,000-yard seasons to stand with them, and I think he can get there. I think he can get there as long as Baker, stays in the form he's in. But we do have another comment here from Cap for Life. Welcome to the show, my friend. And he says, flex spot, Schultz of the Texans, Antonio Gibson's of the Pats, was Amir White of Vegas, and also asking about his defense. Steelers defense or Eagles defense? I feel like the flex spot is very interesting because none of these players have really had standout moments even though you're not asking as much of them as your starters. But if you were to ask me about one person, I would say we're waiting for the Zamir White moment. And I feel like now more than ever, I see a shift in the Raiders where now they're like, okay, we're a really bad team and we need to find ways to control the game. And as much as, Antonio Pierce seems to be preferring Alexander Mattison, Zamir White, not for nothing, seems to be the better option to start going forward. Especially, now that Aiden O'Connell was actually named the starting QB for this week's game. And should he be, I don't necessarily trust him as much as Gardner Minshew to really make a difference in the passing. Especially if Davante Adams is out of here. So, I'm saying Zamir White, this might just be his opportunity to be the breakout player we thought he was going to be. So I would pick White for this week and kind of see where he takes you, because he is a risky pick. But in terms of the Steelers or Eagles defense, I'm just picking the Steelers, even if they lose 9 games this season. I just feel like the Eagles defense, while good, is a defense that schematically I don't necessarily see where you get a lot of fantasy points, if you see what I'm saying. Whereas the Steelers, I personally have them, and they're a team that, yes, may also fit that description sometimes as well. But you know that you're going to get sacks, you know that you could get fumble recoveries, and you know where your points could be coming from. Whereas with the Eagles, I don't necessarily know if they're known for their takeaways more than anything, if you catch my drift here. But good luck to you and your fantasy exploits. Excellent question. If you have any more, please let me know, my friend. You are welcome here anytime. But getting back to my wide receivers and DJ Moore, it just looks like Caleb has found that rapport that he needed to find with DJ Moore to have success. And going up against the Jags, after perhaps his best fantasy game of the year, 27.5 points against Carolina. Yes, it's Carolina, but still, it's something. Going against the Jags, I feel like this is the week we finally see the Bears offense we want to, and have wanted to, for weeks and weeks. And because DJ Moore is who he is, I feel like he's going to be the receiver that sets this Bears offense apart. Because it's nice to have guys like Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze there as well, but DJ Moore is the difference maker and the X factor for getting Caleb Williams comfortable, and that's the most important thing for the Bears going forward. And the last player I want to highlight here is kind of a guy who, week in, week out, you kind of have to monitor. As Cat for Life says, what do I do with Davante Adams? Interesting question as well here, too. Davante Adams, if he goes to the Jets, I don't necessarily know how much of a difference he'll make, because they're just so dysfunctional, it feels like, especially with the firing of Saleh and we not knowing who is going to, lead this team going forward. Maybe Aaron Rodgers steps in as the coach because it seems like he has a lot of control, but I digress. Davante Adams just feels like a player wherever he goes, he's going to get a lot of attention. But in terms of fantasy, I feel like he's just going to lose a lot of the value he provides if he goes to a team that, needs him, but maybe not be in the best situation to properly implement him mid-season, you know what I mean? Because if the Jets get him, I'm not sure they can alter that much of their offense just to allow for that Rodgers-Adams connection, if you see what I'm saying. So it's a weird one. I would say you kind of toss him into the waiver wire or trade him away, because I don't necessarily trust him as much as some other receivers who are either on the rise or we already know are superstars. So he's an interesting player still, but he is kind of someone who you might want to discard and let go by the wayside now. But Jaden Reed is certainly someone who is definitely going to be interesting going forward, because he's a player who I feel like a lot of fantasy managers trust, but you got to account for that Packers wide receiver room. And you got to account for the surprising rise of Tucker Kraft. But this week against the Cardinals, in a game that could feel like a shootout at this point, I feel like Jaden Reed is someone who has to be the difference maker, and that's why I choose him. But let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for all your comments throughout this segment as well. Keep them coming if you have any questions. We now transition to our last quote-unquote skill position group in my positional rankings for this week. With the tight ends, which ones do I think will shine as well in Week 6? We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we jump into our fourth segment here of the day, I got a comment from Shep Easy Sweet Spot that I want to highlight. Please waive Adams. I'll jump all over him. Well, it's kind of your funeral at that point, taking a risk on Adams. I feel like, his best bet is with New York, but it's just so, I can't get over the fact that it's so controlling of an environment that I don't know if you can really implement Adams into this team amidst this kind of tension and dysfunctionality, even when he's perhaps the receiver that can calm Aaron Rodgers down the most if he goes there. So it's going to be an interesting situation either way. But I want to get into my tight end positional rankings because this is the position that has been the most volatile these past couple of weeks. And these four guys that have accumulated all have the ability to, week in, week out, be guys that are in the top 5 at the end of their respective weeks. But since no one's really separating themselves in the tight end pack early in the season, as much as I don't enjoy Rodgers reuniting with Adams and they will produce, I think that there is kind of prevailing sentiment in that statement, but at the end of the day, it's a different environment they're in now. Where they were in Green Bay, it didn't necessarily matter on a nationwide scale whether or not they produced. Now the questions will be asked of them if they don't. And that's the difference. And I get that, Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams make magic happen together. And it's something we haven't often see. But in the New York market, where instant gratification matters, if anything were to go awry, if Adams were to go there, they would be crucified together. And a lot of people would then be questioning this mid-season firing of Saleh, even as terrible as he's been. If everything goes awry, and I think it can with that trade, then don't shoot the messenger. But I do want to get into the tight end segment here because all four of these guys compiled, like I said, week in, week out, can be top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or they can fall out of the top 10 completely. Without further ado, let's jump right into this first segment of the day. The first one, as always, a guy who's having a breakout season. It might just be a sneaky guy going forward who could be in the tight end 1 conversation come year's end, and that is Isaiah Likely, going up against the Commanders in perhaps the marquee game of the week. 16.3 fantasy points against Cincinnati, catching that touchdown on that incredible all-world play by Lamar Jackson, just proving to be perhaps the biggest security blanket for any AFC team in terms of the value he adds at the tight end position for the Baltimore Ravens. Because I feel like the Ravens receiving group is very limited in terms of the route tree, but also the fact that this offense is more tailored to what Lamar Jackson can do out of structure than in it. And that kind of benefits Isaiah Likely a bit more than it would most tight ends, because if you can just find a way to get open, sit in the seam, like a Travis Kelce or something, like he always does, the chances are you're going to see a lot of targets as a tight end. That's what Isaiah Likely's doing now. And not for nothing, everyone thought Mark Andrews was going to be that guy, but I feel like Isaiah Likely has made this role his own. And I feel like he's going to become the more physical of the two. He's going to become the more reliable of the two going forward. And it seems weird to say, but he's looking to be perhaps one of the more premier tight end options in fantasy as well. And this game is going to be very important in breaking down, yes, a very suspect Commanders defense, but who knows? Maybe they up the ante as the opponents get tougher. So it's all going to depend on different X factors for both teams, and Isaiah Likely is certainly going to be one of them. And I love the fantasy value he adds in this matchup. And the second guy I'm picking, Pat Freiermuth, a guy we haven't talked about that much since the start of the year. Going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, had a pretty decent game against Dallas this past week. And not for nothing, I kind of feel like, in this Steelers skill position room, you have guys who, are reminiscent of what you want out of a Steelers offense, and Pat Freiermuth perhaps is the guy most embodying that sentiment. And going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, another team that's getting a little bit more dysfunctional as we go along, I feel like Pat Freiermuth's value stems from the fact that the Raiders' run defense might want to key in on, limiting what Justin Fields can do. And so, if we see a lot of what we actually saw in that game against Dallas, where Justin Fields is using short to intermediate passes to kind of settle down, change the tempo of the game, then Pat Freiermuth is going to be a big part of that offensive game script. And so, that's why I like the value here. Going against a defense that still is very tough, but has its holes in it, and just being able to exploit what the Raiders think you're going to do. And just be the guy who gets reliable yardage for your team. That's why Pat Freiermuth has a lot of fantasy value this week. Then the next guy who has had a kind of topsy-turvy start to his season. Dealing with injuries, now coming off this bye, hopefully fully healthy, going up against a defense, like I said, very similar to the Raiders, actually, in that they can be a solid defense, but with all their injuries and, different storylines about them, they are very weak. In the Cowboys, Sam Laporta is going to have a big game. And not for nothing, I kind of feel like even though that Lions offensive performance against Seattle, everyone kind of contributed, Sam Laporta, when he's healthy, you'll see is going to get the lion's share of the targets. When, Jared Goff sits back to pass, which might be less often this season, but it's something that when it happens, he's always going to look for Sam Laporta. Yes, the same can be said of Amon-Ra St. Brown, but that's how this balance works. And it's how Ben Johnson has created the versatility in this offense we're all very familiar with. And so, when I look at Sam Laporta in this matchup, and I look at how limited the Cowboys are right now with their injuries, both in the secondary and the linebacker position, especially with Micah Parsons. You also lost DeMarcus Lawrence up front. You can attack them all over the field at your will if you're the Lions. The Lions perhaps have had sneakily two of the easier defensive matchups over the past couple of weeks. In Seattle, they knew that Seattle's run defense was banged up and they couldn't handle the volume of running they were doing. And they were also able, with that, to pepper in different routes that exploited the back end of the Seattle deck secondary. They were able to get beyond the second level. I feel that it's going to be a similar story in this game, because the Cowboys are terrible at stopping the run, but they're also average at best at kind of limiting the damage control in terms of when teams open up the passing game against them. So it's going to be a game where Sam Laporta is going to be a tactical chess piece that gets moved around a lot, and in many different ways is going to be a chameleon for this offensive game script. And the last guy had a pretty down game this past week, going into a very important divisional game this week of Monday night, I believe, against the Jets. This guy really is going to stand out. And that is Dalton Kincaid, another guy in my team. Going up against the Jets, sorry. I put the Jags in my graphic here, so sorry about the little mix-up. Going up to the Jets. I feel like the thing with Dalton Kincaid is that do they trust him more with, the injuries and questions about the receiving core if, a guy like Shakir Coleman goes down? Or if, he goes down, we see a higher volume of Josh Allen to Khalil Shakir and Keon Coleman passes, even if he were to come back? That's the question. Because I don't necessarily know if Kincaid's value in this offense outweighs the value that they're trying to have with guys like Shakir and Coleman. But against the Jets, I kind of feel like Kincaid's going to be the matchup nightmare for this Jets defense. Because he's going to be someone who, sneakily enough, will extend the field far more than perhaps their other weapons that they have. And that's saying something, because as a tight end, all you really have to do is find the holes in the coverage of the defense and just try and get open to the best of your abilities. You're not the explosive play guy. But Dalton Kincaid feels different in a certain way because of the limitations, of this room. And so that's the question that they have to answer. But let me know what you think in the comments about this game script for all these tight ends. But coming next, right on the other side of this quick break, I'm going to be talking about my weekly shadow report to close out this show, my key wide receiver cornerback matchups that will define this week in fantasy football. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and this one has become beloved by you all watching for its significance in the history of my show. It's one of my favorite segments to do, the weekly shadow report, the wide receiver cornerback matchups that I believe will define fantasy this week. And all of these matchups that I've compiled have been seen before, haven't been seen before, but most importantly, as Sheppy's sweet spot says, so funny that the usual suspects at tight end are out of the picture. Kelsey, Kittle, and Andrews. I agree with that because you just don't know. You just don't know which tight ends will step up. A lot of the young crop of guys is starting to get more attention, and as the season goes on, who knows? Maybe Kelsey, Kittle, and Andrews will become more important. Obviously, injuries are hitting some of their respective teams, but you'll have to see. But then we have another comment here from SJMP. Welcome to the show, my man. Hope everything is well with you. And he was just offered a trade. He says, Jaden Daniels, Travis Etienne, I believe. That's a very interesting way to spell it. Bucky Irving for C.J. Stroud, Kenneth Walker, and Jaleel McLaughlin. Who wins this trade? I think the guy who gets Jaden Daniels, Etienne, and Bucky Irving wins this trade actually by a country mile. As he also says, the rest of my lineup is Breece Ayuk, McLaurin, Jalen Tolbert, George Kittle, Tampa kicker, Denver defense. My bench is Alexander Madison, Rashad White, Devontae Adams, Christian Kirk, and Zach Ertz. I am the Jaden Daniels team. I would not accept this trade then if you are the one trading away Jaden Daniels, because this guy, yes, and I understand, this matchup specifically is not one that you favor. But if you are in a 2 QB league or you have a guy on your bench you trust for this week, then just bench Daniels, and going forward he's going to have a much easier slate. But you can't trade him away. As much as I love C.J. Stroud, and I love that fact that he has so much upside as a fantasy QB and adds a lot of value, he's not worth it. And then it gets kind of interesting because I love Kenneth Walker, especially as a fantasy running back. But the value of both Etienne and Bucky Irving far outweighs, Kenneth Walker and then a non-entity in the fantasy world in Jaleel McLaughlin, who's been really disappointing, if you want my opinion on him. So I like the balance of what you have with Jaden Daniels, Etienne, and Bucky Irving. And then when I look at your bench, you have a lot of solid options there as well. As in Madison, he's not a bad option. White as well. When I look at the layout of your team, I feel like you just need to supplement a guy like Breece Hall at the running back position with more depth. And then you are set at the wide receiver position as far as I'm concerned. So overall, I would keep every single one of those players. But if there's a chance, that one of your running backs falters, then maybe you can find a more even trade where you can still get a Kenneth Walker, because he is a difference maker. And not for nothing, as much as I like the fact that you have a very deep running back room, there are weaknesses there as well. So you may want to revisit this trade in the future, but for now, there's just too much value in a guy like Jaden Daniels and a guy in Bucky Irving, who's perhaps one of the better backups in the league, to let them go immediately. But thank you for your comments, and good luck to you, my friend, in your fantasy football exploits. But to close out today's show, I do want to get into my weekly shadow report with the 4 matchups. Or actually, do I have 5? I only have 4 for this week in my weekly shadow report. The first one is Jamar Chase and Deonte Banks. And I believe this is the first time both of them are facing each other, because this is an interconference game between the Bengals and the Giants, and it could be a weird one. And this matchup will define it, because we look at who Deonte Banks has faced already this season. He just clamped up DK Metcalf. He's had matchups against Justin Jefferson. I believe he's had matchups already with, who else did the Giants play? CeeDee Lamb. He's already faced a gauntlet of fantastic wide receivers. And not for nothing, yes, the Bengals offense is the unit that I'm least worried about on that team. But the Giants' defense looked very impressive in terms of their pass rush and how their coverage was sticky. And Deonte Banks is a big part of that. If Deonte Banks can hold up in coverage against these guys, then the Giants' defense is just better for it. But Jamar Chase is going to be an interesting test, because he's going to get a lot of targets for this team. So look out for this matchup. It's first one in this kind of rivalry, but it's one that I kind of feel is very evenly balanced, depending on, how the Bengals offense approaches this Giants defense, so that it doesn't necessarily get quote-unquote upset in this game, because it's going to be a weird one. But it's up to your interpretation here. And then the next one is Garrett Wilson versus Christian Benford. This is one we have seen before, and we will see throughout this year, but it just got a lot weirder with the circumstances surrounding the Jets, and whether or not, Garrett Wilson actually is your wide receiver 1 going forward. Because He's really struggled this season. He's only had, I believe, only one 100-yard game. And he doesn't seem like he's really meshing well with Aaron Rodgers, even when Aaron Rodgers is trying to force the issue there. And so, if the Davante Adams rumors are true, and Davante Adams ends up in, New York, then Garrett Wilson loses a lot of value. And then, on the other side of things, Christian Benford, not for nothing, has been part of a Bills secondary that has completely exceeded expectations. Yes, these past couple of weeks they kind of got rocked a little bit, but that's due to other injuries surrounding this defense. And Christian Benford, though, has been one of the most admirable players for them and one of the most integral parts of why, they're not completely falling to pieces. But this matchup certainly feels like it could have been bolstered, had Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson gotten that connection right straight out of the gate. But right now it feels like this matchup is a little bit uneven in terms of where these two players stand. But it's still a divisional contest, and who knows? Maybe Salah was the problem all along. And maybe, getting that kind of, whatever kind of toxicity was there out of there was a good thing, or will be a good thing for this Jets offense. But until we see it play out in the field, in a game that really has new stakes now, is going to be something to monitor for everyone involved. But it's still perhaps the most fascinating wide receiver cornerback matchup of the week because of this game's importance and significance. As we get another one from T-Money, long time no see, my man. 10-man PPR, Burrow, Jacobs, Gibbs, CeeDee Lamb, Chase, Kincaid, DK, Wicks, Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy, Josh Downs, Jacoby Myers, Worthy, Brooks on IR, 3-2, 3-2, trade Kincaid for Laporta. Now, we've seen many trades, especially at the tight end position, much like this, where people are placing a lot of stock in this younger generation. And I really like both of these guys a lot. And I feel like if you were to trade one for the other, I don't really know whether or not you would get more value from a guy like Laporta, because both of the Bills and Lions offense rely on these two guys a lot more than we think. So, depending on week and matchup, potentially trading Kincaid for Laporta is interesting, and it won't necessarily hurt you. But, my question is, why would you go out and get a guy who's super similar and try and trade him for another guy who's just as similar? And I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad trade, but I'm certainly skeptical of what Laporta could add to this team in terms of value, because it's a solid team from top to bottom. And you have a lot of stacks, you have a lot of interesting players, and a lot of depth at different positions. So, I would stand pat here. I would say if Kincaid is a worry, it should be a very minimal one, because week by week he could be the difference, but he can't hurt you, is what I'm saying. He's not going to hurt you by being on your team as much, or Laporta being on your team. Neither of them is going to hurt or hinder your team going forward. So I don't see how much of a difference trading Kincaid for Laporta would make, because of how similar they are in terms of how they're going to play out each week. That's just my advice. Good luck to whatever you decide to do in your trade and in your fantasy football league. And the final one I kind of want to highlight is, one that I was kind of second guessing myself about, but now know the injury thing. This one is a very interesting one. Terry McLaurin and Marlon Humphrey. Now, I don't think this game will be decided necessarily by the Commanders' offense, but it is kind of contingent on how much they'll do with a little, because I don't necessarily think the Commanders are going to win the time of possession battle in this one. So Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin's connection is going to have to be on from the start. Because if not, they're not going to score points in the way you have to against a Baltimore Ravens team. And I feel like Terry McLaurin is going to be a very interesting X factor in this game, because you have to weigh the opportunities you're going to find in this game. Do you find the matchups you want and get Terry McLaurin going deep? Or do you kind of accept the fact that you need to kind of keep Jaden Daniels in the short to intermediate, mistake-free football kind of area? Because that's what you might have to do against a Ravens defense who takes no prisoners. So that's why I think this matchup is going to be very important. And maybe not one where Terry McLaurin wins outright, but he still might get one over on Humphrey in this matchup. But let me know what you think in the comments, but that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been Chris Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And before we go, I do want to remind you yet again to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network, as a great appreciated thing to do for the network as well. But also keep in mind about super chats, super thanks, and super stickers features. They're a great way. As Team Money, I'll take your last comment. Okay, what about trying DK, Kincaid, and Downs for Devontae Smith and Kelsey? That was an interesting one. And I think that, you can't accept that once they come back healthy, as we're changing Downs to Worthy. I think that could be accepted, because I think that Devontae Smith will elevate this Eagles offense once he comes back, and Kelsey will get going. I know it sounds cliche, as I've kind of put down the notion that Kelsey is going to be a star tight end over the past couple of weeks, but I still think Kelsey is going to be important going forward. So that's a trade you could kind of justify, you know what I mean? But we do have to end today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember, super chat, super thanks, super sticker features to contribute and interact with the show. Like, follow, and subscribe. But other than that, thank you all. I'm Chris Shepard, and I am out.